Please join me in prayer. Open our eyes that we might see wondrous things in your word. Amen. I want to begin this morning with a story about Tom Herman, football coach at the University of Houston. Herman's story is told by journalist Mark Tracy. When the University of Houston's football players arrive for a game, writes Tracy, they know what to expect as a prelude to these coming hours of brutality as they file into the stadium. A kiss on the cheek from their head coach, Tom Herman. It's an unusual ritual in a sport that embodies America's most rigid ideals of manhood. A kiss on the cheek is when he shows his love for us, said one player. For Coach Herman, there's no better way to demand the painful sacrifices of playing football than to forthrightly show affection for his players. How do you motivate a human being to do things against their nature, he asked. There are two ways, love and fear. And to me, he says, love wins every time. Journalist Mark Tracy continues, Herman's kissing rite has earned praise from psychologists. He's disrupting a stereotype about boys and men, a notion of masculinity that says boys and men are only driven by the desire for competition and autonomy, said one professor of psychology from New York University. When what we're really driven by is the desire to be connected in communities. The kisses, writes Tracy, are part of a larger message of brotherhood that Coach Herman has made the core of his coaching style. I'm a bit confused as to why the kiss has garnered so much attention and why it seemed so odd, said Coach Herman, because I think most college coaches would tell a young man in recruiting or his parents, hey, I'm going to love you and treat you like my son. Some players, he continued, said it was the first time they'd ever been kissed by a man. Several of his players grew up fatherless. From what I can gather, said one player on the team, your importance to the team is directly related to the duration of the kiss. If you stay more than 5 seconds there, you're a dude, as Coach calls it. The player added, as it's gone on longer and longer over the years, I've somewhat looked forward to it. That Times piece is part of a wave of articles and studies that have been produced in the run-up to and then in the wake of the presidential election. What is masculinity, they all ask, in the age of Trump? Or to put it another way, is it okay to kiss a football player on the cheek? Masculinity seems like an appropriate topic on this day, Father's Day, a day that is more than just colognes and power tools and new ties or socks. It's the day we pause to celebrate the adult male presence in the family, the person who is our children's first daily encounter with adult masculinity. Of course, defining masculinity is tricky. According to the Women and Gender Advocacy Center at Colorado State University, masculinity is the socially constructed behavior and culture associated with men. The center published results from a study of the most frequently used words by advertisers of toys for boys and girls. For girls, the most frequently used words by toy advertisers were love, fun, magic, friendship, hair, party, and fashion. For boys, the most frequently used words were battle, power, stealth, launch, heroes, and action. In his book, The Descent of Man, Grayson Perry argues that modern-day masculinity is in crisis because our ideas about what it means to be a man are several thousands of years old, dating back to a time, he writes, when masculinity was to chase things and fight things and make babies. Modern boys and men, writes Perry, are being conditioned to be something that is no longer needed in society. Primed, says one reviewer of Perry's book, for conflict and dominance and aggression in societies that are evolving to prize tolerance and emotional intelligence instead. This crisis of masculinity, writes Perry, could be one reason why 93% of all people incarcerated in the US and 95% in the UK are men. In a study conducted earlier this year, researchers asked a sample of 18 to 30-year-old males about masculinity. Based on feedback from the study, researchers coined the term the man box. The man box, they write, is a set of beliefs communicated by parents, families, the media, peers, and other members of society that place pressure on men to be a certain way. These pressures tell men to be self-sufficient, to act tough, to be physically attractive, to stick to rigid gender roles, to be heterosexual, to have sexual prowess, and to use aggression to resolve conflicts. I couldn't help but think of the man box this week after hearing reports that Travis Kalanick, CEO of Uber, was taking a leave of absence. Uber, like many Silicon Valley companies, is dominated by so-called bro culture, what various articles have defined as a worldview that favors young men and rule-breaking, beer on tap before company dinners, tolerance when it comes to sexual harassment, a lack of diversity, and a fratty or Mad Men-like atmosphere. The immaturity of bro culture, the hypersexuality and rigid gender roles of the man box, the archaic masculinity of chasing and fighting that Grayson Perry writes about. And then there's Tom Herman, that college football coach who plants a wet kiss on the cheeks or foreheads of his players. These all seem like profiles in modern masculinity. Today's scripture readings add an ancient perspective to this discussion. In the first two sets of stories, we read about two Old Testament heroes, two stereotypical men's men, so to speak. Samson with his bulging biceps and superhuman strength, and David with his courage and his deadly aim with the slingshot. Both stories, for many of us, were staples in the Sunday schools or vacation Bible schools of our childhoods. I remember filling out coloring books about Samson and David with my Crayola crayons when I was little. In today's first reading, the hero Samson is portrayed as God's gift to Israel. His birth was miraculous, and his parents dedicated him to God as a lifelong Nazirite, a sort of ascetic, which meant his diet was restricted and his hair couldn't be cut. I've always imagined Samson to be a physical specimen, macho and handsome and hairy. According to legend, Samson's great strength came from his long hair and also from periodically entering ecstatic, almost trance-like states. Each time Samson performed some superhuman exploit, the reader is told that God's Spirit had rushed upon him. The Hebrew wording is quite forceful. Literally, God's Spirit seized or grabbed Samson, hurling him into a trance-like state, and in that state, he became like a superhero. In these trance-like states, Samson could tear apart lions and wild beasts. He once slew 1,000 enemy soldiers with only the jawbone of a donkey as his weapon in one of these states. There was even a tale about him capturing 300 foxes and tying torches to their tails before sending them to burn down the grain fields of his enemies. It should go without saying that these aren't literal stories, not a journalist's notes of actual events. These are legends, like Homer's Iliad or Virgil's Aeneid, or like Beowulf, or more recently, like the exploits of Wonder Woman on film. Samson was a tragic hero, feared by his enemies, idolized by his friends, a rule breaker who lacked a clear moral compass. He could even be sadistic at times, delighting in the suffering of his foes. Perhaps Samson lived in an ancient mailbox, or man box. The irony of the story is, of course, that in spite of his great strength, his machismo and bravado, his lover Delilah tricked him into revealing the secret of his strength. With his hair shaved, he was captured and enslaved, and eventually died by suicide, bequeathing to us thousands of years later the moral lesson about how even the proudest and the mightiest and the brawniest among us can fall. Today's second tale is the well-known David and Goliath story. This is one of those Bible stories that almost everyone, church-going or not, has some familiarity with. David, a young shepherd, visits the front lines of a war between Israelites and Philistines. Each army is encamped on a mountain, and the valley in between is the turf they're fighting over. But instead of fighting army against army, the Philistines send their champion, the giant Goliath, who's nearly 10 feet tall, to talk trash to the Israelites, daring one of them to man up and face him in single combat. No Israelite is brave enough except young David, who steps forward without armor, without a sword or a shield, carrying just 5 smooth stones and a slingshot. And as the giant scoffs, David cuts him down with a single stone. Let me insert a footnote here. Slingshots in ancient Israel weren't little pellet shots like we see today. A good stone back then was the size of a baseball, and the sling was a small bag that was whirled around above the head, releasing a shot that could exceed 100 miles an hour. So a direct hit, no matter how ginormous Goliath was, would have been deadly. Which is not to detract from the moral of the story, which I take to be that the world's most forbidding giant things can be toppled with just a little courage and ingenuity. To me, the difference between Samson's tragic heroism and David's stunning success is explained in our third reading for this morning from 1 Corinthians. There, Paul instructs his readers to be courageous, be strong, but, he writes, let all that you do be done in love. Samson sure was macho, and he performed some amazing feats. He was courageous and strong, in the words of St. Paul. But Samson's masculinity wasn't driven by love. He was a bully, destructive, and reactionary. We might even say he was emotionally stunted inside his misogynistic man box, only thinking of himself and his fragile ego. But David went on to great success, becoming Israel's greatest king. It took strength and courage for him as a young man to face down the giant, but he did it not for personal glory, to pad his ego or to shine light on himself. He risked his life to save others, to save his fellow soldiers. And I bet if we asked him, he, like so many soldiers who've been in combat, probably wouldn't have called his actions courageous or heroic. He was just trying to save the people next to him on the battle line. It was Jesus who once said, "There is no greater love than this, than to lay down your life for your friends." This is the sort of courage and strength that puts someone else first, that chooses to love by being willing to sacrifice yourself, your needs, to preserve your unit, your friends, your family. And there's real strength in that, real masculinity, honorable and powerful. In her article titled "How to Raise a Feminist Son," Claire Kane Miller writes, "Teach boys to show strength, the strength to acknowledge their emotions. Teach them to provide for their families by caring for them. Show them how to be tough, tough enough to stand up to intolerance. Give them confidence to pursue whatever they're passionate about." Or, in the words of St. Paul, teach them to be courageous and strong, and let all that they do be done with love. Let me end this morning with a story told by Michael Kimmel. Kimmel has written several books on masculinity, including Manhood in America and Angry White Men. He gave a talk recently titled, "Why Gender Equality is Good for Everyone, Men Included." Here's what he says. When men first hear about gender equality, many of them think, well, that's right, and that's fair, and that's just, that's the ethical imperative. But not all men. Some men think, as the light bulb goes off, oh yes, gender equality, and they will immediately begin to mansplain to you your oppression. They see supporting gender equality something akin to the cavalry, like Thanks very much for bringing this to our attention, ladies. We'll take it from here. Of course, gender equality is fair, and it is right and just. But more than that, gender equality is in our interest as men, says Kimmel. It turns out, according to most studies, that those countries that are the most gender equal are also the countries that score highest on the happiness scale. And that's not just because they're all in Europe. Even within Europe, those countries that are more gender equal also have the highest levels of happiness. It is also good for companies. Research has shown conclusively that the more gender equal companies are, the better it is for workers, the happier the labor force is. They have lower job turnover, they have lower levels of attrition, they have an easier time recruiting, they have higher levels of retention, higher job satisfaction, and higher rates of productivity. And the other thing is, gender equality is good for men. It's good for the kind of lives we want to live. Young men especially want to have lives that are animated by terrific relationships with their children. They encourage their partners and their spouses and their wives to work outside the home and find satisfaction in their careers. Kimmel continues by sharing a riddle that stumped him as a young man, but which illustrates this point. The riddle goes like this. A man and his son are driving on the freeway, and they're in a terrible accident, and they're both brought to the emergency room. The emergency room attending physician sees the boy and says, "Oh, I can't treat him. That's my son." When I was younger, says Kimmel, I was flummoxed by this. Who was the ER doctor? I decided to do a little experiment with my 16-year-old son. He had a bunch of his friends over, and I posed the riddle to them. The boys immediately turned to me and said, "It's his mom." No problem, just like that. Except for my son, says Kimmel, who said, "Well, he could have had two dads." But this is an indicator, he says, of how things have changed. Younger men today expect to be able to balance work and family. They want to be dual career, dual carer couples. They want to be involved fathers. In 1915, Kimmel concludes, on the eve of one of the great suffrage demonstrations down Fifth Avenue in New York City, a writer in New York wrote an article in a magazine, and the title of the article was Feminism for Men. And this was the first line of that article. Feminism will make it possible for the first time for men to be free. I wanted this sermon to be a series of profiles in masculinity, from a Houston football coach who kisses his players to Grayson Perry, who says that our modern notions of masculinity are thousands of years outdated, to the man box, to the bro culture of Uber, to Samson's tragic tale, to David's selfless courage, and finally to Michael Kimmel's point that feminism can make men free. But I think the words of St. Paul keep coming back to me the most. This Father's Day and every day going forward. Words that can help us leap out of the man box and smash the patriarchy of our society. Be courageous, says Paul. Be strong, he says. But let everything be done with love. Amen.